for Canada. In 2023, the U.S. produced about 400,000 tons of potash, but they consumed 5.3 million tons of it. So what does its capacity to produce potash domestically look like? And I ask that because President Trump has talked about, I want automakers in the U.S., I want things made in the U.S. so that we're not importing from places like Canada, but can they?
And to be honest with you, Canada only works as a state. It doesn't, we don't need anything they have.
Still obviously have to have Canadian potash, and so that import tariff would just be something that would have to be absorbed.
It began with something most Americans had never heard of, a quiet mineral buried deep beneath Canadian soil. By August 2025, that resource had erupted into the center of a geopolitical storm. Potash, the fertilizer ingredient often nicknamed pink gold, is not just another obscure commodity. It underpins nearly half of the world's food supply, making it as vital to global stability as oil or gas. For decades, the United States leaned heavily on Canada to keep its farms supplied and its crops thriving. But on August 1st, Washington rolled out a 35% tariff on Canadian potash, turning fertilizer into a bargaining chip in a high-stakes trade war. Within days, markets trembled. Prices jumped to the $350 to $360 per ton range, roughly 21% higher than the year before, squeezing everyone from corn growers in Iowa to wheat farmers in Kansas. Analysts and farmers alike were left asking, was this about protecting American industry, or was it the start of a food security crisis no one had prepared for? The ripple effects hit immediately. What began as a line item in Washington's tariff policy morphed into a crushing burden on America's agricultural heartland. The United States consumes more than 5 million tons of potash every year, but produces only a fraction of that, around 400,000 tons. The rest has long come from across the northern border, with Canada supplying nearly 90% of U.S. imports. When tariffs landed, the numbers spoke louder than politics. By the spring of 2025, market prices had surged from roughly $33 per ton to $348 in just 2 months. That spike may sound like a technical detail on paper, but for farmers calculating every acre of corn or wheat, it translated into an existential blow. Fertilizer and input costs ballooned, making it harder to break even, let alone plan for the next harvest. Even Nutrien, the Canadian giant at the center of the supply chain, warned that U.S. farmers would be the ones carrying the heaviest weight of the new policies. For producers in Iowa, Kansas, Nebraska, and beyond, it meant higher bills with no clear path to relief. The question was whether this really represented a strategy to strengthen American agriculture or a fast track to weakening it. As costs climbed with no ceiling in sight, the frustration simmering across the Midwest boiled over. From Iowa to Kansas, farmers watched their margins evaporate almost overnight, turning what should have been a profitable season into a financial sinkhole. The National Farmers Union, representing tens of thousands of producers, issued a formal letter denouncing the tariff policy, an unusual move that underscored just how desperate conditions had become. By the close of 2025, fertilizer and lime together accounted for nearly 7% of total production costs, a share farmers argued often meant the difference between survival and failure. The consequences reached beyond spreadsheets. Lower yields loomed over wheat and corn producers in Nebraska, Missouri, and Kansas, threatening to reshape food supply chains across the United States. And when grain falters, the effect cascades outward. Meat, dairy, fruits, and vegetables all began to inch upward in price, pulling consumers into the same spiral of economic pain that had started with a single tariff decision. While American farmers raised their voices in anger, Ottawa quietly took a different path. Rather than mirror Washington with retaliatory tariffs, Canada began reshaping its strategy in silence. The message was subtle but deliberate. Instead of fighting fire with fire, potash itself will become the long-term weapon. Policy choices shifted toward quotas, domestic reserves, and targeted incentives. Nowhere was this more visible than in Saskatchewan, the province that anchors Canada's potash industry. There, the government announced investments worth an estimated 400 million Canadian dollars into storage infrastructure and emergency stockpiles. By late 2025, domestic reserves reached their highest level in 5 years, enough to cover at least 2 full planting seasons. The move wasn't only about insulation. It was about leverage. By building buffers and stabilizing supply at home, Canada positioned itself to withstand external shocks while simultaneously creating new opportunities. The ripple extended beyond policy. More than 1,500 jobs were added across Saskatchewan, breathing fresh life into local economies and reinforcing the idea that potash could serve as both a shield and a growth engine. Canada's quiet maneuvering did more than stabilize its domestic base. It opened doors to an entirely new trade map. For Ottawa, the crisis became a chance to transform dependence into strategy, ensuring that potash would not just feed its fields but strengthen its global hand. While the United States struggled to contain the fallout of rising farm costs, Ottawa moved decisively, signing an agricultural framework with India and securing long-term supply agreements with China. These were not just commercial contracts. They were strategic lifelines that guaranteed Canada a foothold in two of the world's most demanding fertilizer markets. Momentum built quickly. In Europe, the shock of volatile food prices left governments scrambling for reliable partners. Germany, the Netherlands, and Poland opened exploratory talks with Canadian officials, framing fertilizer not as a simple import but as a pillar of national security. Japan, heavily reliant on external suppliers, soon joined the negotiations, seeking guarantees that fragile agricultural sector would not be left vulnerable to sudden shortages. Even closer to home, Mexico signaled openness to a deeper partnership with Canada, floating proposals to reduce its dependence on U.S. supply chains. For Mexico, this was not just about economics. It was about insulating itself from Washington's unpredictable trade politics and charting an alternative path toward agricultural stability that be by the end of 2025. The shift was undeniable. The G20 formally classified fertilizer as a strategic resource, placing it in the same tier once reserved for oil and natural gas. That recognition carried enormous weight. It reshaped how governments, corporations, and investors calculated their exposure to food insecurity. And at the center of this emerging system stood Canada, controlling nearly 40% of global potash production and wielding a new kind of leverage that extended far beyond its borders. The question became difficult to ignore. Was the world witnessing the rise of a resource superpower forged not in oil or metals, but in the minerals that feed humanity itself? As America sank deeper into its farm crisis, Canada experienced the opposite reality. A tidal wave of international capital, investors who once poured money into oil fields, technology firms, or speculative real estate, suddenly began chasing potash. They treated it as the ultimate food security asset in a world rattled by tariffs and trade wars. The transformation was striking. Shares of Canadian mining giants such as Nutrien not only climbed, but in some cases doubled within months, reshaping balance sheets and fueling aggressive expansion plans. Toronto, long recognized as a financial hub with deep ties to energy markets, rapidly evolved into a nerve center for global mineral trading. High-stakes negotiations once reserved for crude oil futures now revolved around fertilizer contracts, linking potash directly to the strategies of nations anxious about feeding their populations. For hedge funds and sovereign wealth funds, the calculus was clear. Potash was no longer just another commodity. It was insurance against instability. Analysts argue that fertilizer had entered the same tier as oil, gas, and rare earths, resources that define not only markets but also geopolitics. The sense of urgency was heightened by mounting fears of supply disruptions, climate volatility, and population growth that could stress global food systems. This wave of attention brought billions of dollars into new extraction projects, advanced processing facilities, and massive storage hubs across Saskatchewan. Entire towns, once vulnerable to commodity cycles, began buzzing with construction and hiring as international capital underwrote Canada's rise as a resource superpower. Commentators began calling the country the OPEC of fertilizer. For many Canadians, the implications went even further, a chance to anchor their national economy to one of the few resources every country needs every single year without exception. What had begun as an attempt by Washington to shield American agriculture quickly morphed into the very force that weakened it. By late 2025, analysts estimated that tariffs of 25 to 35% could add as much as $100 per ton to the cost of potash in the United States. That increase did not just squeeze farm budgets. It rippled outward into grocery aisles nationwide. Food inflation, which policymakers had spent years struggling to restrain, began creeping back. Meat, dairy, and produce climbed steadily in price, leaving ordinary households paying more for the same shopping basket they had bought only months earlier. For many families, the promised protection of domestic industry felt more like an invisible tax draining their wallets. On Capitol Hill, the tension broke into open debate. Lawmakers sparred over whether the tariff should be rolled back to give farmers breathing room or whether conceding would undermine Washington's broader trade strategy. Each hearing became a proxy battle over a deeper question. Was self-sufficiency worth the economic pain it inflicted? The slogan of making America self-reliant began to lose its shine. Instead of symbolizing strength, it revealed fragility, a reminder how quickly protectionist walls can turn into cages when built around essential resources a country does not truly control. The potash dispute revealed more than a trade spat. It exposed the outlines of a new world order where food security itself could be weaponized. With control over nearly 38% of global supply, Canada now holds a lever few nations can ignore. And with the United States dependent on its northern neighbor for around 90% of imports, Washington suddenly found itself in the uneasy position of economic hostage to a partner it had long taken for granted. What emerged was not just a pricing battle, but a quiet unraveling of one of North America's closest alliances. An economic divorce of sorts, silent but undeniable, began reshaping how both nations viewed their future. In Ottawa, the mood was pragmatic, even optimistic. Potash was no longer just a mineral. It was leverage, insurance, and influence rolled into one. In Washington, the mood was defensive, unsettled, and politically charged. Farmers demanded relief. Consumers grumbled at higher prices, and policymakers struggled to reconcile slogans of independence with the reality of dependency. The ultimate question lingered over every boardroom and cabinet meeting: who would control the safety valve of global food security in the decade ahead? If the story of potash teaches anything, it is that the smallest grains can carry the heaviest weight in